200 feet above a stilling basin churning white with runoff, 5 soldiers flattened themselves against a crumbling concrete face that was shedding chunks the size of car doors, watching a crack over their heads widen another finger's width with a sound like the world's slowest gunshot. 400 yards back at the motor pool, Sergeant Billy Sorrell knelt over a spread tarp of climbing rope, coiling it inch by patient inch, while behind her, the radio net erupted with the news that the dam was coming apart and there was no one qualified to go over the edge. The strike had come an hour before dawn, a single stray round meant for the switching yard on the ridge that had instead clipped the crest of the Harrow Dam, and for the first 10 minutes nobody had thought much of it. The structure had stood for 60 years holding back the Absalom River, feeding turbines that kept the lights on in 3 river towns, and a reservoir behind it that watered more farmland than anyone downstream liked to think about when they weren't forced to. A glancing hit on a headworks building was not the kind of thing that brought down concrete 18 feet thick at the base, and for a while the duty officer's log simply read, "Minor structural damage, no immediate risk." But the round had done something worse than crack the wall outright. It had shocked a hairline fault that ran diagonal through the downstream face, a flaw the engineers had known about for a decade and rated as stable under normal load. And stable things do not stay stable forever. Once something hits them hard enough and a full reservoir keeps pressing against the wound. By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, the fault had opened into a visible seam 30 feet below the crest. Weeping first, then spitting, then shedding fist-sized rubble onto the catwalk that ran along the face at the 200-foot mark, the maintenance walkway that let engineers reach the intake gates and the penstock housings without descending the whole wall on ropes every time a valve needed eyes on it. A 5-man inspection team from the 14th Engineer Support Company had been out on that catwalk when the seam let go, sent at first light to eyeball the strike damage before anyone understood how bad it actually was. It was routine work, the kind the company had done a dozen times since the unit had taken responsibility for the dam's security 6 months earlier. Walking the face with a camera and a clipboard, checking gate seals and drainage weeps, the least dangerous assignment on anyone's weekly rotation right up until the exact morning it wasn't. Now the catwalk itself was buckling, torn away from its mounts in 2 places, and the 5 of them were spread along what remained of it in a ragged line, each one gripping a rail that groaned every time the wall shuddered beneath them, with the spillway roaring below and, somewhere behind the fracture, a reservoir the size of a small lake pressing harder against the wound with every minute that passed. Word of the strike had reached the wider base almost as fast as it had reached the company, because the Harrow Dam was not just a piece of infrastructure the 14th happened to be guarding. It was the reason the whole sector had any electricity at all, the reason 2 field hospitals could run refrigeration for blood and medicine, the reason a rear area command post further down the valley could keep its servers cold enough to function. Every soldier who heard the first radio call understood, in some rough, intuitive way, even before the engineers said it out loud, that this was not a 5-person emergency contained neatly at 200 feet. It was the kind of morning that could reshape the whole valley's next month depending on how the next 20 minutes went, and that pressure sat over the crest of that dam as heavily as the spray coming off the spillway. Staff Sergeant Marisol Odom had the presence of mind to get a head count and a status report out on the platoon net inside the first 90 seconds, which was the only reason anyone at battalion knew what was happening before the whole catwalk went into the basin. "Any station, this is Rampart 1-6. We have 5 personnel stranded on the downstream face of the dam at approximately elevation 200 feet. Catwalk is failing. Request immediate extraction. How copy?" The answer came back fast and useless. Command was already trying. A pair of Black Hawks had scrambled off the pad within 4 minutes of the first call, and both pilots had come back within 4 more with the same report. The spillway was venting at a rate that was throwing turbulent air off the face in gusts, strong enough to tear an aircraft sideways, and neither crew could hold a stable hover close enough to the wall to lower a hoist without risking a rotor strike on the concrete. One pilot put it plainer than the report needed. "That's not wind. That's the whole gorge breathing. I get within 30 feet of that wall and my aircraft doesn't belong to me anymore." No air rescue, no ladder truck that could reach 200 feet up a curved concrete face with a river trying to eat the base of it, and no way to bring heavy equipment onto a structure that was actively shedding its own surface into the water below. Whatever was going to save Odom's team was going to be built by hand at the crest in the next few minutes, or it was not going to exist in time to matter. That was the crisis Billy Sorrell was 15 seconds from hearing about when Staff Sergeant Amos Teague came around the corner of the supply tent at a dead run, out of breath in a way that told her before he said a word that whatever he was about to ask her was not routine. She looked up from the rope she was coiling, a habit so old and so automatic that her hands kept moving even while her eyes tracked him, and waited. Teague had never once, in the 8 months she had served under him, asked her for anything beyond an equipment count. He was asking now, and somewhere behind him, faint under the wind, she could already hear the low, wrong note the spillway was making, a sound like a river that had decided to be a flood instead. Nobody on the base had ever thought to ask Billy Sorrell what she used to be because the answer seemed obvious enough not to need asking. She was the soldier who ran the equipment cage for the 14th Engineer Support Company, the one who signed for every coil of static line, every carabiner, every harness and helmet that moved in or out of the Connex box behind the motor pool. She inventoried. She inspected webbing for fraying and retired anything past its service life, without complaint or ceremony. She coiled rope the way other soldiers cleaned rifles, over and over, in the same practiced loops, and if you asked anyone in the company what Sergeant Sorrell did, they would tell you she kept the gear straight and stayed out of the way. And they would say it with a kind of gentle, unthinking dismissal, the way you'd describe furniture that had always been in the room. It was not unkind most of the time. Amos Teague liked her fine. He signed her performance reports on time, praised her paperwork, and had never once, until this morning, needed anything from her beyond a clipboard and a signature. If pressed, he would have said she was competent, quiet, maybe a little too quiet, the kind of NCO who had clearly had a rougher road somewhere before she landed in a supply cage and decided that was where she'd stay. Nobody in the unit knew where that road had run. Her file, the parts anyone below battalion level could see, was thin and unremarkable. Prior enlisted, a gap of 2 years between assignments that nobody had ever asked her to explain, then 4 years as an equipment and rigging NCO with commendable but unspectacular evaluations. She had a call sign, Basalt, that she'd picked up somewhere before this unit and never explained, and when people used it, they used it the way you'd use a nickname for someone's dog, fondly, without curiosity about where it came from, what none of them knew. What sat 2 years back in a personnel record, most of them would never have clearance to pull, buried under a single unclassified line that nobody had bothered to read, was that Sergeant Billy Sorrell had once been one of 9 instructors certified to teach the Army's technical high-angle rescue course, the program that trained soldiers to move through vertical terrain nobody else would touch. Rock faces, collapsed structures, flooded gorges, dam faces and spillway aprons, the kind of ground where a helicopter could not help you, and the only tool that mattered was a rope, an anchor, and the judgment of the person managing both. She had built rescue systems on cliff faces in weather that grounded aircraft. She had lowered soldiers into collapsed buildings on ropes she had rigged herself, trusting her own math because there was no one else's math to trust. Students who came through her course left calling her by her call sign, the way you'd say the name of a standard you were trying to live up to, and instructors from other schools used to sit in on her classes just to watch how she read a structure before she ever touched it, the way she could stand at the top of a route for a full minute doing nothing visible at all, and come away knowing exactly which 4 feet of rock or concrete could not be trusted with a life on the end of a rope. She had been, by every measure that mattered inside that small, unheralded world, one of the best there was, and she had known it quietly, the way competent people know true things about themselves without needing to say them out loud. And then, on a training exercise on a rock face 210 feet high, in conditions that should have been routine, an anchor she had inspected and cleared had failed under a student she was lowering, and the student had died before anyone could reach him. The investigation cleared her. The anchor had a flaw invisible to any inspection method available at the time, a manufacturing defect 3 years old, and every board that reviewed it said so in writing, in language as generous and as final as institutional language ever gets. It did not matter. No finding on a piece of paper could undo the 10 seconds she had spent watching a rope come apart in real time with a person she was responsible for on the end of it, and no board's language could give her back the version of herself who had believed, before that morning, that her judgment was enough to keep people alive no matter what the equipment did. For a long time afterward, she found herself running the same 10 seconds over and over in her head at night, looking for the one thing she should have seen and hadn't, even though every honest part of her understood there had been nothing to see. She stopped climbing the day they zipped the bag, put in for a lateral transfer to logistics before the funeral, and had not touched a harness for anything beyond storage and inventory in the 3 years since. She told herself, and had mostly convinced herself, that the woman who used to go over edges for a living did not exist anymore, that she had traded her for a woman who kept other people's ropes clean and coiled and never asked to use them. It was a smaller life. It felt, most days, like the only honest one available to her, the only one where nobody's safety depended on a piece of equipment she could not fully control. There had been offers in the first year to bring her back into some version of that old work, a training command that wanted her expertise, a quiet inquiry from a friend who still taught the course and thought she might want to return in an advisory capacity where she'd never have to run a live line again. She had turned down every one of them without much explanation, because the explanation would have required saying out loud that she no longer trusted the version of herself that used to say the word safe with total confidence, and she was not willing to say that to anyone who might have believed her. Sorrel! Teague was in front of her now, hands on his knees, hauling breath. 5 of Odom's team are stranded on the dam face, catwalks failing, air can't get close because of the shear coming off the spillway. Captain wants every rope and every carabiner in your cage up at the crest in the next 5 minutes, and she wants someone who knows how to rig them. He straightened up, looking at her the way he'd look at any competent supply sergeant being handed an unreasonable request. I don't know what she thinks you can do besides hand out gear, but that's the order. Truck's outside. Something in Billy's chest did a thing it had not done in 3 years. A cold, clean drop. The exact sensation of standing at an edge and deciding to step off it. Step off. She looked down at the coil in her hands. Finished now. Perfect. 40 meters of static line looped and ready. And for the first time since the funeral, she thought about it not as inventory, but as a tool with her name still on it, whether she wanted it there or not. Load the truck, she said, already moving. All of it. I'm driving. The crest of the Harrow Dam was a controlled kind of chaos by the time the truck arrived, headlights catching the spray that drifted up off the spillway like fog rolling backward. Captain Delia Marchbank, the company commander, was standing at the guardrail with a radio in each hand, and a face that had the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to. Below her, past the rail, the downstream face dropped away into haze, and somewhere in that haze, 5 soldiers were holding onto a structure that was actively failing beneath them, while a few miles further down the valley, a town of a few thousand people sat in the flood shadow of that wall, without knowing yet how close the morning had come to changing their lives too. Talk to me, Marchbank said, without turning, the moment she registered Sorrel's boots on the concrete. It was First Lieutenant Kieran Ballard who answered, stepping in from the side with a tablet full of structural readouts and a face gone grey under a layer of dust. Ballard was the engineer officer attached to the company, young for the responsibility, sharp, trained in bridges and load calculations and soil mechanics rather than rescue work of any kind, and at this exact moment, terrified in the specific way of someone who understood the numbers better than anyone else present and hated every one of them. She had spent 2 years learning to certify structures as safe within careful, generous margins, and every instinct that training had built in her was screaming at the plan already forming at that rail, because nothing about a crumbling dam face in high wind fit inside any margin she had ever been taught to trust. "Ma'am, the fault's propagating faster than the model predicted. We've got maybe 20-25 minutes before the section below the catwalk sheds enough mass to take the whole platform into the basin, and that's a generous estimate. The reservoir behind the crack is backing up against the fracture and rising, which is adding load, not reducing it. Every minute that section holds is a minute we're not owed. And if that fault opens all the way through before we get people off it, we are not just talking about 5 soldiers anymore. We're talking about a flood wave hitting the valley towns with next to no warning, which is a different disaster on top of the one we already have. QRF, with technical rescue assets, is 31 minutes out," Marchbank said. It was not a question. It was the number everyone standing at that rail had already done in their heads and hated. "They don't have 31 minutes," Ballard said. "They might not have 20. Somebody had already floated the obvious question and had it shot down before Sorrel's truck ever reached the crest. Could the 5 soldiers simply climb down themselves, hand over hand along whatever structure remained, without waiting for anyone to rig anything at all? Odom had answered that one over the radio herself, flatly, the way a team leader reports a fact she wishes were not true. Specialist Doss had a wrenched ankle from the initial shock of the catwalk buckling and could not bear weight on a vertical descent, and 200 feet of fractured, wet-shedding concrete was not a climbable surface for anyone without rope, an anchor, and training that none of the 5 of them carried. Whatever solution existed had to come down to them. It could not come up from them. Billy Sorrel stood at the edge of that conversation with a truck bed full of rope behind her, and did the same arithmetic everyone else at the rail had already run, and arrived, as she had known she would before Teague finished his sentence back at the cage, at the same brutal conclusion. Air support could not get within 30 feet of the face without a real risk of putting a helicopter into the concrete. Ground rescue equipment, ladder trucks, the aerial platforms the fire department at the reservoir town could offer, none of it reached a fraction of 200 feet, and none of it could be driven onto a structure that was actively shedding its own surface. The only asset on that crest that could reach 5 soldiers hanging on a dying wall in the next 20 minutes was rope, an anchor, and a human being willing to go over the edge on both, and every second spent debating whether that was an acceptable plan was a second taken out of a clock that had already been unforgiving before anyone opened their mouth. "Ma'am, permission to observe only until QRF technical arrives," Ballard said to the captain, not to Sorrel, because as far as Ballard knew, there was no one else on that crest with any business commenting on a vertical rescue. "I don't want anyone freelancing an anchor system on a structure I can't certify. If we rig something that fails, we don't just lose the 5 on the wall, we lose whoever's on the rope with them." It was a reasonable thing to say. It was also, Billy understood immediately, a version of the order everyone always eventually gave her, phrased with more urgency and better intentions than most. "Wait, observe, let the people whose job this officially is handle it. Don't put your hands on something you weren't invited to touch." She had spent 3 years agreeing with that instinct in herself. She had built an entire quiet life around agreeing with it, had let it become the shape of who she was allowed to be. And she stood there for perhaps 4 full seconds, watching spray drift up over the rail and hearing, faint under the roar of the spillway, a voice on Odom's radio reporting that the section under Specialist Barantes had just dropped 6 inches, and she understood with total clarity that this was the one morning in 3 years where agreeing with that instinct was going to get 5 people killed while everyone waited for permission that made sense on paper and meant nothing to a wall that was already coming apart in real time. "Ma'am," Sorrel said, and it came out steadier than she expected. "I can rig a system off the crane rail at the crest and get down to them faster than QRF can land. I've done this." Marchbank turned and looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the supply sergeant standing at her guardrail with a truck of climbing gear and no obvious business being the one to speak. "Done what exactly, Sergeant Sorrel?" "Technical rescue," Billy said. "Vertical. It's what I did before I did this." She did not explain further. There was no time to explain further, and some part of her, the part that had spent 3 years hiding from exactly this conversation, still flinched at saying more than the minimum required. Ballard's face did something complicated. Not quite dismissal, not quite belief. The particular skepticism of an officer who has just been asked to bet 5 lives on a claim from someone whose file, if anyone had time to pull it, showed nothing but 4 years in a supply cage. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't have a structural basis to trust an anchor built off that crane rail in these conditions, and I've never seen this soldier's rigging credentials. If it fails—" "If we wait for something we can certify," Billy said, "there won't be a wall left to certify it on." The math was already brutal and getting worse by the second. 20 minutes, generously. A rope system had to be built, tested, and used 5 separate times in less than that, over 200 feet of failing concrete, in wind that had already grounded 2 aircraft, above a river that would not care whose paperwork was in order when it finally took the rest of that catwalk down. Marchbank looked from Ballard's warning to Sorrel's steady, unreadable face, then out at the haze where 5 of her soldiers were running out of wall, and made the only call a commander could make with the clock she'd been handed. "Do it," she said. "Ballard, help her however she asks. Teague, get her whatever gear she wants off that truck now." There was a service crane bolted into the crest of the dam, a relic from the last major maintenance cycle, its rail sunk deep into concrete that predated the fault line by decades and had never shown so much as a hairline crack in any inspection. It was not designed to anchor a human rescue system. It was designed to move gate machinery in and out of the control house for servicing. Billy Sorrel looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds, reading load paths and structural geometry the way another person might read a familiar paragraph, and decided it was the only thing on that crest solid enough to bet 5 lives on. She built the anchor the way she had built 100 anchors before the world took climbing away from her, methodically, redundantly, refusing to trust any single point no matter how strong it looked, backing up her primary connection with a second independent system tied to a separate structural member entirely so that no single failure, however catastrophic, could cut the line between the crest and the wall. Kiran Ballard stood close the entire time, arms crossed, watching her hands with the tight focus of an engineer who wanted very badly to find the flaw and could not. Twice, Ballard opened her mouth to object to a choice Sorrel made, and twice she closed it again, because the more she watched, the less it looked like improvisation, and the more it looked like something rehearsed 1,000 times, somewhere Ballard hadn't been. A fluency that no amount of book knowledge could fake under this kind of pressure. Below them, through gaps in the crest railing, the turbine hall's intake grates hummed on, indifferent, still drawing water that had no business being trusted to keep flowing normally through a structure coming apart 30 feet away from it. "That's still going onto a rail with no rescue load rating," Ballard said finally, unable to hold the objection in any longer. "I can't sign off on this being safe." "I'm not asking you to sign off," Billy said, running a final check on her primary connection with the flat, unhurried hands of someone who had done this exact motion in far worse weather. I'm asking you to watch the crest side of this system while I'm on the wall side of it, because you're the only engineer here, and I need eyes on the anchor I can't see once I go over. If it moves, if you hear anything change in that concrete under the rail, you get on this radio and you tell me before I feel it. Can you do that? It was not the answer Ballard expected. It was not deference, and it was not arrogance either. It was a request for help, precise and specific, from someone who clearly understood exactly what she needed and exactly what she didn't. Ballard, despite every reservation still sitting in her chest, found herself nodding. I can do that. Amos Teague arrived at the crest with the second load of gear from the truck, in time to watch Billy step into a harness she had pulled from her own cage, a harness he had personally inspected and signed off on a dozen times without once imagining it would ever leave that Connex box on her body. He watched her run a system check on herself with the same hands that usually filled out equipment logs. Fast, silent, complete, and something about the economy of the motion made the back of his neck go cold in a way the spray off the spillway hadn't managed. "Sorrel," he said, "that rail's not rated for this. I've walked that inspection route myself. If that concrete lets go while you're on the rope, then Lieutenant Ballard tells me over the radio and I do something about it," Billy said. "Amos, I need you managing the haul line at the crest, not the argument. Can you do the job or not?" It was the first time in 8 months she had used his first name, and it landed harder than any rank ever could have. Teague looked at her for one more second, looked at the 200-foot drop behind her, looked at the calm, unbothered set of her shoulders as she clipped in, and made the same decision Ballard had just made, for the same reason. Whatever this woman had been before she became the sergeant who signed his equipment logs, she was not guessing right now. "I've got the haul line," he said. "Go." She went over the edge into the spray with the practiced, almost unhurried economy of someone stepping off a curb, and the wind that had turned 2 Black Hawks away hit her within the first 10 feet of descent, a hard sideways gust that swung her against the concrete and knocked the breath half out of her chest. She let it happen, absorbed it with bent knees against the face the way a climber absorbs a swing, and kept descending, reading the wall as she went, watching for the next place the surface looked ready to shed, tracking the deep, wrong vibration coming up through the concrete every time another piece of it let go somewhere out of sight. Below her, through the haze, she could see the ragged shape of the catwalk, and 5 soldiers pressed flat against it. One of them, the youngest by the look of him, a kid who could not have been more than 2 years out of basic, staring up at her with an expression of pure, disbelieving hope, the look of someone who had stopped expecting rescue and was being handed it anyway. The first haul went to Staff Sergeant Odom, the team leader, because Odom was the one who could help manage the other 4 once she was off the wall, and because Odom's section of catwalk was closest to a fresh crack that looked ready to open at any moment. Billy clipped her in, checked the connection twice, and gave the signal for Teague to start the haul. 200 feet is a long way to be pulled up a crumbling wall on a rope anchored to a rail nobody had ever rated for the job, and every foot of it, Billy stayed in the water beside Odom, one hand steadying her against the face, talking her through the swings and shudders in a voice that never once rose. By the time Odom's boots cleared the crest rail, both Ballard and Teague were watching Billy Sorrel, the way you watch someone whose whole shape has changed in front of you, and neither one of them said a word about the rail rating again. The second haul went faster, because now there was a rhythm to it. Down, clip in, signal, ride the rope up beside the soldier while Teague and 2 other NCOs worked the haul line at the crest, back down again before the rope had even stopped swinging. Sergeant Rona Nair came off next, calm and economical about it in a way that told Billy she'd trust her own hands over anyone's panic, the kind of soldier who asked one clear question got one clear answer, and simply did what she was told without wasting breath on anything else. Then came Corporal Ansel Cade, who gripped the rope so hard on the way up that Billy had to remind him twice to let his legs do some of the work instead of fighting the whole 200 feet with his arms, adrenaline making him fight the system instead of trust it. Each extraction ate into the 20 minutes Ballard had estimated at the start. Each one bought at the cost of Billy's hands, which were already raw inside her gloves, from the friction of a system never designed to be run this many times this fast. She did not stop to notice the pain. There was no room in her attention for it, not with the wall still shedding chunks of itself into the basin below, and the reservoir behind the fracture visibly higher against the crack than it had been 10 minutes earlier, the water finding new inches of concrete to press against with every haul that bought them more time. It was during the third haul that the wind did what the pilots had warned it would do. A gust came off the spillway with enough force to swing Billy and Cade together against the face, hard, and for one long second, the whole system shuddered in a way that made Ballard's radio crackle to life at the crest before Billy even felt it in her hands. "Basalt, this is Ballard. I've got movement in the rail mount. Small. Watch your load." Billy did not argue and did not panic. She simply adjusted her position on the wall, took more of the shock in her own body and less in the anchor, and kept climbing, because that was the entire discipline she had spent a career building. Read the structure, trust the math, never let fear make a decision that judgment should be making instead. Cade came over the rail white-faced and shaking, and it was Amos Teague, not Billy, who had to tell him to let go of the rope before it could be sent back down, his hand steady on Cade's shoulder in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd only ever seen Teague running an equipment inspection. Below, on what remained of the catwalk, only 2 soldiers were left. Specialist Truett Doss, favoring the ankle that had ruled out any thought of climbing down on his own, and clinging to the same section of rail with both arms locked around it. Specialist Nico Barantes, the youngest of the 5, 20 years old, on his second deployment, and visibly past the point where courage was doing him any good. Billy had clocked him from her very first descent, the particular stillness of someone who has stopped believing help is actually coming, and she had made a decision without saying it out loud to anyone. Doss next, because his injury and his exposed position left him no way to help himself if the platform gave without warning, and Barantes last, because Barantes needed more than a rope. He needed someone to talk him down off the edge of his own fear before the rope could do anything for him at all. And that kind of talking could not be rushed, not even with the clock they had left. The 4th haul, Doss, went clean, if slower than the others, because the fault line beneath his position had opened enough that Billy had to find a new path down the face to reach him, threading a route between 2 sections of visibly unstable concrete, with the unhurried precision of someone reading terrain that had nearly killed her once before, and had taught her, in the process, exactly what to respect, and exactly what she could still trust. Above her, at the crest, Captain Marchbank had gotten a runner to bring up a hard case from the command post, a slim folder pulled off a satellite terminal in the 4 minutes since Sorrel had first said the words "technical rescue" out loud. Marchbank had wanted, urgently, and without fully admitting it to herself, to know who exactly she had just bet 4 lives on, and the answer had come back from personnel in a single line buried under 2 years of routine, unremarkable supply sergeant evaluations. Instructor, Army Technical High-Angle Rescue Course, 4 years certified, honorable transfer following line-of-duty incident review, no fault found. Marchbank read it twice, standing at the rail with the wind pulling at the page, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with relief, and everything to do with a kind of quiet, furious respect for a woman who had spent 3 years letting an entire company believe she only knew how to coil rope, and who had apparently decided that was a fair trade for never having to explain the rest of it. By the time Billy reached the last section of catwalk, the section holding Nico Barantes, the reservoir behind the crack, had risen high enough that the sound of it had changed. A deeper note under the spillway's roar, and Kieran Ballard's voice came over the radio with a flatness that told Billy the estimate had just gotten worse. Basalt, models updated. We're looking at 10 minutes, maybe less, before that section fails completely. I need you both off that wall. Billy did not answer immediately. She was already beside Barantes, one hand locked on the rail next to his white-knuckled grip, close enough to see that his eyes were fixed not on her, but on the 200 feet of empty air below his boots, and close enough to recognize, in the set of his jaw, the exact look she had seen on a rock face 3 years ago, on a boy who had also stopped believing his own hands could hold him up. "Barantes!" She said it quiet, steady, the exact register she had once used on a rock face, with a terrified 19-year-old whose harness had jammed on a route she'd built herself. A memory she let surface now on purpose for the first time in 3 years, because it was useful, because it was the only tool left in her kit that mattered more than rope. "Look at me. Not down. Me." His eyes found hers, wide, wet with something he wasn't going to call tears in front of anyone, and she held them there while her free hand ran the connection onto his harness, without him having to watch it happen. "You don't have to climb. You don't have to hold on, right? You just have to let this rope do the one thing it's built to do, and let me do the one thing I'm built to do. And in about 90 seconds, you're going to be standing on flat ground, wondering why you were ever this scared. Can you give me 90 seconds? It took him 3 tries to get the words out. "Yes, Sergeant." The last haul was the one that nearly cost them everything, because 10 seconds after Billy gave the signal, the section of concrete directly above the remaining catwalk mount let go in a single sheeting collapse, an avalanche of rubble that missed both of them by a margin measured in feet rather than yards, and sent a shockwave through the whole system that every person on that crest felt through their boots. At the crest, Amos Teague was on the haul line when it happened, and it was Teague, the same man who had told her an hour earlier that the rail wasn't rated for this, the same man who had questioned every choice she'd made from the moment she stepped into a harness, who threw his full weight into managing that line the instant the shock hit, calling the tension out to the 2 soldiers backing him up in a voice gone completely level with focus, buying Billy and Barantes the half-second of controlled slack they needed to swing clear of the falling debris, instead of into it. Nobody had asked him to be the one on the rope for the hardest haul of the day. He had simply moved into position when Billy went over the edge the 5th time, without a word, because somewhere in the last 15 minutes he had stopped needing to be convinced and started needing to be useful, and that was the only kind of apology a man like Amos Teague ever really knew how to give. They came up together, Billy and Nico Barantes, over the rail and onto solid ground at almost the same instant that the last section of catwalk finally gave way completely and dropped in a long grinding cascade of concrete and torn steel into the stilling basin 200 feet below, exactly where he had been standing 90 seconds before. Barantes sat down hard on the concrete of the crest, both hands shaking, and did not try to hide it, and nobody standing around him made him feel like he needed to. Captain Marchbank was already moving toward them, before Billy had even gotten her hands off the anchor system, the personnel record still folded in her jacket pocket, and when she reached Billy, she did not say anything about the record at first. She simply put a hand on the sergeant's shoulder, the way a commander does when words are going to fail the size of the moment, and said, "All 5. "All 5, Billy confirmed, and her voice, for the first time all morning, shook just slightly on the second word. It was Kieran Ballard who asked the question everyone else was thinking, and nobody else had the nerve to ask out loud. "Where did you learn to read a wall like that? That wasn't luck. That wasn't even just training. That was somebody who's done this 100 times in conditions that should never have let anyone survive it." Billy looked at the drop where the catwalk had been, at the white water churning where 5 lives had nearly ended an hour before dawn, and for a long moment said nothing at all, because the answer lived in a place she had not visited out loud in 3 years. Then Captain Marchbank pulled the folded page from her jacket and held it out, not as an accusation, but as a kind of quiet permission. "I already know," Marchbank said. "1 line, in a file nobody bothered to read past the last 2 years of it. Instructor, best in the program, according to the people who trained under her." She looked around at the small circle that had gathered. Ballard, Teague, Odom, Nair, Cade, Doss, and Barantes still catching his breath on the concrete. And let the silence do the rest of the explaining, because some truths do not need a speech to land. Amos Teague was the one who broke it, and he did it the only way he knew how, plainly, without apology, dressed up as anything fancier than it was. "I told you that rail wasn't rated for this," he said, and for a second it sounded almost like the argument starting again, until the corner of his mouth moved, the closest thing to a grin his exhausted face had left in it. "Glad I was wrong about how much that mattered." He held out a hand, not for a salute, just a hand, and Billy shook it, and something between them settled into a shape it had never had before. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but something a great deal more honest than 8 months of unremarkable performance reports had ever built. What happened over the following hour was, by the standards of a story like this one, almost unremarkable, and that was the whole point of it. QRF arrived 26 minutes after the 5th haul, found 5 soldiers already off the wall, and a company commander already writing the incident up, and the technical rescue specialists who climbed out of that vehicle spent a long moment looking at the anchor system still rigged off the crane rail before one of them said quietly, to no one in particular, "Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing." Nobody corrected him. Nobody needed to. Downstream, in the town that would never know how close it had come to a very different morning, church bells that had nothing to do with any of it rang for a service that started on schedule, because the wall had held for exactly as long as it needed to and not 1 second longer. And the only reason anyone could say that with a straight face was the woman now sitting quietly at the crest, recoiling a rope with hands she would not let anyone see too closely. There was no ceremony at the crest. There rarely is, in the real version of a story like this one. No crowd, no music, just 5 soldiers walking off a dam on their own legs who should not have been able to, and a handful of people who had watched it happen standing quietly in the aftermath, recalibrating what they thought they knew about somebody they'd worked beside for months without ever really seeing. Nico Barantes found her before the trucks left, still sitting with a water bottle someone had pushed into his hands, and he did not try to make a speech either. He just said, "Thank you, Sergeant," and she nodded once, the way she'd nod at anyone reporting equipment returned in good condition, and that was enough for both of them. Marisol Odom, on her way past, paused just long enough to say what the others were all thinking, and none of them had quite the words for yet. "Whatever they used to call you before this unit," she said, "I hope somebody still does." In the days after, nothing about Billy Sorrell's job changed, and that was exactly the point of the story the company quietly kept telling about her. The way units do when something extraordinary happens to somebody who never asked to be extraordinary in front of anyone. She still ran the equipment cage. She still signed for every coil of static line and inspected every harness that came back through her Connex box. And if the soldiers dropping gear off with her now stood up a little straighter, held her gaze a little longer, said her call sign instead of her rank without quite meaning to, she never mentioned it and never seemed to need them to. Amos Teague started bringing her coffee in the mornings, which he had never once done in 8 months, and neither of them ever discussed why. Kieran Ballard requested her by name as a consultant on the emergency repair plan for the fault, And this time nobody at battalion questioned why an engineer officer wanted the supply sergeant's signature on a structural risk assessment. Captain Marchbank filed her own report on the incident within the week, and where regulation gave her only a line or two of space for a recommendation, she used every word of it, describing in plain, unembellished language exactly what she had watched a supply sergeant do with a service crane and 40 meters of rope that 5 separate engineers and 2 air crews had all, independently and correctly given their own tools, said could not be done. Nothing about the outcome of that report changed Billy Sorrell's daily duties, and Billy never asked what it said or where it went, because that had never been the reason she went over the edge in the first place. Nico Barantes, for his part, put in a request 3 weeks later to cross-train in basic rope handling under her supervision, the first of what would eventually become a short, informal, entirely unofficial line of soldiers in the company who wanted to learn even a fraction of what they'd watched her do on that wall, and she said yes to every one of them, slowly, on her own terms, one careful lesson at a time. By the time the convoy rolled back down to the motor pool that first morning, the sun was fully up over the ridge, and Billy Sorrell was back where the whole morning had started, kneeling over a tarp behind the supply tent with the same rope in her hands, coiling it inch by patient inch. Her palms were raw under fresh gauze, the friction of 5 hauls having taken more skin than she'd admit to anyone who asked. And she did not admit it to anyone who asked, because nobody asked. They watched her instead, from a respectful distance, Teague, Ballard, a few soldiers from Odom's team who lingered near the motor pool longer than their business there required, and none of them said anything, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud. She finished the coil, set it in its place in the cage exactly where it belonged, and reached for the next one. And if you had walked past the supply tent that afternoon without knowing what had happened at the crest, 200 feet above a dying dam wall that morning, you would have seen exactly what everyone had always seen: a quiet sergeant, coiling rope, keeping the gear straight, staying out of the way. You would have had no idea what her hands were actually capable of. No idea that the woman kneeling there in the dust had spent the last 3 years quietly grieving a version of herself she believed the job had taken from her for good, only to find, in the space of 20 brutal minutes on a failing wall, that it had been waiting the entire time for someone worth going back over the edge for. That, in the end, was the only part of the story she had ever wanted anyone to know. If a story like this one is worth anything to you, the kind of quiet courage that never asks for the credit it's owed, like this video and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, would you have waited for the order or gone over the edge?